Hi, Ed.
Good morning, Mark.
Hey, so this is Mark Goldberg with the UN Dispatch, and I'm talking to Ed Morrissey, otherwise known as Captain Ed of Captain's Quarters blog. Ed, I would say you visit Ed's site at captainsquartersblog.com, but you're moving on, is that right?
I am moving on. I'll be moving to Hot Air, which is at hotair.com, and looking forward to making that move. I think it's a good move for me, and it gives me a much bigger platform with which to work. So it should be a lot of fun. I've already been posting over there the last couple of days, and it's been a lot of fun integrating into that site.
Now, this is Michelle Malkin's operation, is it not?
It is. Michelle Malkin is. I will be working directly for Michelle Malkin as a writer for Hot Air, and it's a different site than her own site. She has her own site in which she does most of her writing. She will occasionally write at Hot Air. But for the most part, it's myself and another blogger nicknamed Alapundit, who does most of the writing at Hot Air.
All right. Well, so I guess viewers could probably get a sense that I'm talking to a diehard conservative here, and glad to be doing it. Very glad to be doing it because it's something that what I wanted to get into with you today is exploring some of the roots of conservative angst with the UN. Sort of what when you read your site or other conservative sites, you just sort of feel a lot of hostility towards the UN, and I was just be hoping that we could flesh that out a bit. So I guess I'll turn it over to you now. So what's your beef?
Well, I think that there's a number of reasons why conservatives have an issue with the UN. For the first part is that it was really set up in a Cold War format, and the circumstances of the world have changed, and the format in which it is, the format of it, the vetoes, the way the Security Council is structured, and the rest of it really is more or less an anachronism in a post-Cold War world. Secondly, and that's more of a technical issue. Secondly, the UN sees itself as sort of a world government, which gives conservatives a lot of pause because they don't want to see the U.S. give up any of its sovereignty. Rather than being just a multilateral diplomatic forum, they see themselves as something transcendent. And the problem with that is that the member states are not democracies. For the most part, they are countries that are something very much less than democracies. There's not a lot of accountability built into that sort of a structure, and that is a very troubling notion for a lot of conservatives. And we see this in the way some things are handled at the UN. Most egregiously, probably, is the Human Rights Commission, which sprang from I believe it's the Human Rights Committee now. It was the Human Rights Council before.
It's the Human Rights Council now. Previously, in its other incarnation, was the Human Rights Commission.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But the problem here is that you have the countries with the worst track records running the show there. You've got Cuba, you've got Saudi Arabia, you've got other nation states that are some of the worst offenders in human rights that are running the agenda there. The reason why they disbanded the first one was because of its relentless focus on Israel above all other things. As soon as they formed the new council, the exact same thing happened, to the point now where Canada doesn't even want to deal with this, and Canada has been a very UN-friendly country, and they have pulled out of the latest anti-racial conference because of this, and they're not going to come back as long as this version of the HRC is doing exactly the same thing as the previous version of the HRC. You had the world's biggest fraud occur at the United Nations, which is the oil for food scandal. Billions of dollars disappeared into that. It went into Saddam Hussein's pockets. The very person that they were trying to marginalize wound up becoming filthy rich because of the oil for food scandal. And the UN has not done anything in terms of accountability for that particular scandal. There is no accountability in this organization, and I think conservatives look at this organization, and there are other issues as well that go to accountability. Accountability is the big deal in that sense. And
okay, maybe we could sort of start to you listed a lot of things.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, that's fine. Maybe we can start to unpack them. In what ways do you see the UN as sort of embodying a world government? When I think of government, I think of things like the monopoly of the use of force or the ability to levy taxes on its citizens through the use of threatening the use of force. In sort of no ways do I see sort of the UN as sort of having those powers that we assume that we assume a government would have.
That's a good point, Mark. But I mean, there have been proposals floated at the UN to impose taxes through the UN on various issues. The Law of the Sea Treaty is another issue where I think you could say that they're trying to become the government of the oceans. And I just don't see the UN as being the proper structure for that. I believe in diplomacy, but I don't think the UN it should be the only place where that occurs. And I think multilateral diplomacy would be better served by finding like-minded nations to band together to work through these issues.
I got to say, I sort of monitor a lot of what right-wing blogosphere says about the UN, and a constant theme, it seems to me, is this idea that the UN is going to impose taxes, that has sort of a scheme to impose taxes on Americans, and I just don't understand where that idea comes from. I mean, to me, it seems that the only institution with the ability to levy taxes on American citizens is the IRS.
Congress,
I don't see that. Or Congress, right. I just don't see the IRS enforces the tax code. I just don't see sort of any. I just don't see it. Is like maybe am I missing something here?
Well, I don't think the UN has tried to do it. I think these are suggestions that have floated up through the UN. These are the types of things, though, that reflect an idea that the UN is a world government body. The idea that you have to go to the UN for approval before you take action against a country that threatens you is an interesting notion, and it would be a lot more effective if people who could block that decision aren't the same countries that are threatening you or potentially threatening you. And the fact is that the structure, the way that the UN is structured, it makes it very difficult for the United States to take action to defend itself, against upcoming threats, and even against present threats. And the idea that you have to get Russia and China to sign off on our foreign policy every single time an issue comes up is inimical to the nation pursuing its own interests.
I guess sort of 2 points. One, in the UN Charter, I believe it's Article 5, they do assert the right to self-defense. There's nothing preventing a country from defending itself absent Security Council approval. That's maybe a technical matter, but I guess the point you raise about, for example, Russia and China serving sometimes as an obstacle to our foreign policy is a fair one. But when you look at sanctions regimes that we've tried to impose, say, on North Korea, a stumbling block is, you're not incorrect in saying that a stumbling block tends to be obstruction from China. However, those sanctions regime become much more effective once we do get China on board. For example, you see what happened with North Korea. So North Korea in something like October 2006. North Korea detonated its bomb. A month later, the Security Council unanimously imposed sanctions on North Korea. A couple months later, North Korea went back to the bargaining table, and now they've sort of opened up their nuclear reactor at Pyongyang, and sort of we had the New York Philharmonic there sort of yesterday. On the 24th, because this airs on Sunday.
Yeah, but Mark, I mean, you're assuming that the only mechanism that was at work in this was the UN, and that's simply not true. What was much more effective was getting the nations that are around North Korea, including China, in a separate multilateral formation to apply that pressure.
Right,
it wasn't the UN sanctions. It wasn't the UN sanctions that did that trick. That was the six-party talks that the United States conducted around North Korea.
But you have to remember the North Koreans withdrew from the six-party talks in the months prior to them detonating that nuclear weapon. And once the Security Council sanctions were passed, the North Koreans decided to enter that six-party talks. And then that February 2007, sort of the Bush administration announced sort of the deal.
The issue, I'm going to have to disagree with you on this. The issue wasn't the UN sanctions, because the UN had pretty much already isolated North Korea. The issue was China, and it was China's decision to pressure North Korea that made that change possible. That pressure came through the six-party talks. That pressure actually came mostly from Japan in dealing with China, and with Japan threatening to escalate their own military arsenal, and China absolutely not wanting to see that happen. But that was through the six-party talks. I'll give you another example, and the example is Iran. We have passed very weak sanctions against Iran for their pursuit of nuclear technology and hiding that nuclear technology from the IAEA. And we're continuing to see Iran blow smoke. I don't know any other better way of putting this. Past the IAEA, and even Mohammed al-Baradei, who has been sort of, I would say, less than objective about this, can't say that Iran is still being honest about their intentions, and yet the UN Security Council continues to kick this can down the road.
I guess maybe once again we disagree on causation. So I would agree that the Security Council sanctions imposed on Iran are substantively weak. However, I think it's clear that their intended political effect has been felt in Tehran. If you look at the NIE report, for example, Iran had ceased its ceased pursuing a nuclear weapons program in 2003, right when the situation was kicked to the Security Council.
I would disagree with you. I would disagree with you on that. I think the actual impetus for that was the invasion of Iraq and the fear of what the United States was going to do after that. Also, that same NIE only had moderate confidence that Iran did not restart its nuclear weapons pursuit, and they still don't have an answer on the Green Salt project. Iran has never revealed what they are doing with that. And so there's a lot of basis there. There's a lot of room there for danger. And these are people who will use a nuclear weapon if they get it. They'll either do it directly or they'll do it indirectly through their connections to Hezbollah, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad. And that's the reason why it is so critical to stop this before they get to that stage. I mean, it's a worse situation than North Korea because of their ties to terrorist groups. And their already demonstrated willingness to use them as proxies in war. And
I would say, I guess I again would maybe disagree with you about sort of looking at the evidence of the state of the Iranian sort of nuclear weapons program. It seems to me that the most recent IAEA report was sort of similarly bolstered the sort of NIE report from last year and sort of blew cold water on the accusations that Iran's nuclear program is active and as developed as people think. I mean, and again, this has turned sort of Daniel Pletka and Michael Rubin, for example, in the Wall Street Journal this past week, had an op-ed accusing Mohammed al-Baradei of being anti-American because once again he is sort of coddling Tehran.
Well,
meanwhile, he seems to just be making recommendations and analyzing the situation based on evidence. And if you look at, say, Mohammed al-Baradei and the IAEA's track record, it seems to be a track record, particularly in Iraq as well, where once again, no one listened to him, but al-Baradei was saying, we don't really have any evidence of an Iraqi nuclear weapons program. Similarly, he's saying things about Iran, and to me it seems that sort of we have to listen to this guy who keeps telling us right information. We as Americans might better form our foreign policy based on sort of credible information that we're being supplied by the IAEA.
Well, part of that, certainly we're getting that information. And part of that, though, is the fact that Mohammed al-Baradei still can't account for the Green Salt project. The Iranians refuse to account for that.
Can you explain? I don't know what the Green Salt project is.
And they have refused to allow access to the military installation where that Green Salt project was taking place.
What is Green Salt? Can you explain? I just don't know anything about that.
Green Salt, in a nutshell, was a research project that has to do with nuclear fissile material development that has been a worrisome development in terms of an alternate path to a nuclear weapon. And this was something that had been revealed Probably about the same time, I think, as the weapons program was revealed. The other track of the weapons program was revealed. That was the what do I want to say, the AQ-Con uranium project, and we've never heard what this was about. This is a nuclear project at a military facility, and it's part of that Wall Street Journal editorial that you were referencing. They also talk about the fact that we still have not gotten any answer about the grain salt project. They refuse to answer questions about it. So there is no intelligence on that. The IAEA has not given us a report on that. And while the Iranians remain intransigent on that issue, the UN Security Council has dithered. They've issued some rather weak tea sanctions against the Iranian regime, which has had some economic impact on Iranians, but hasn't budged them from their refusal to address these issues and to allow IAEA inspectors into those facilities. So, in point of fact, the IAEA still is in the dark on some of the nuclear weapons programs pursuits that the Iranians had in process. But I don't want to get too much into the weeds on individual issues here. I think the bigger issue with conservatives is the fact that the UN is primarily comprised of nations which aren't democracies, whose leaders aren't accountable to their people. And the UN itself is structured much the same way. There is not a lot of accountability here. When the Oil for Food program erupted, there was no way to purge the people who were responsible for that. You could shame them into maybe resigning, but there was no way to account for that. When you have for instance, in the American government, Congress can conduct investigations. They can, people get charged with crimes. And, in fact, Congress had to do that in this case because they claimed Turtle Bay as sovereign so that they could prosecute some of the people involved in the scandal. Otherwise...
I have to interrupt for 1 second. So I guess when we talk about the oil for food scandal, I see it in sort of there are two different categories of the oil for food scandal. There's the oil smuggling, which occurred, and that amounts, when you say it's like a $100 billion scandal, these billions come from the oil exports from Iraq to Jordan that occurred during the time of the Iraq sanctions, during the time of the Oil for Food program. That said, that smuggling was sort of done under the watch and known by the Security Council, by members of the Security Council, including the United States, including Russia, including France. The second part of the scandal, which I think is the part that irks conservatives more, and frankly, it looks bad upon the UN itself, is the kickbacks that were alleged. That
right.
in order for the certain the contracts to be given, Saddam Hussein offered kickbacks to UN employees, and as it turns out, the amount we're talking about, while it's grave and the problem is serious, is not a lot. And the person in charge of the oil for food scandal who received the kickback, his name is Benan Savan, is now he was fired by the UN. He's in exile in his home country of Cyprus and wanted by the U.S. attorney in the United States. He's alleged to have taken $200,000. That's sort of what the Volcker Commission found.
Well, it wasn't.
It wasn't, and that's a problem. That's a problem.
That wasn't the extent of the kickbacks. The kickbacks went to people in France and Russia who were part of the government, and and we're talking about
in Texas as well. I don't know if you know.
And they kicked back money to Saddam Hussein, who was supposed to be contained by this program. Okay, and so the idea of UN containment of Saddam Hussein was a fallacy. It was a fantasy. He was getting enriched by this program. He was using that money to buy smuggled military goods from Russia, France, and China. And this has been amply documented. Through Syria, he was acquiring weapons and materials that were denied to him by UN sanctions that were that were sold to him by the very countries that supposedly on this UN Security Council had imposed these put Saddam in his box. And it was a waste of time. It was a complete waste of time. And what's more is it was costly to everybody. The British and the Americans were trying to impose this containment on Saddam Hussein. In the meantime, our supposed allies on the UN Security Council were undermining it practically the entire time.
I think I have to disagree with you on the waste of time. While I can see that the massive smuggling did occur, Fact is that the Iraqi population were fed their nutrition baselines increased. Meanwhile, Saddam was rid of his weapons of mass destruction, to the point of it.
Well, wait a minute, because the UN itself, the UN
point.
Security Council was insisting that those sanctions were killing 5,000 Iraqis a month, and they were demanding that those sanctions be lifted in 2001, 2002, because the sanctions were killing Iraqis at a rate of 5,000 a month. That was the demand from Russia and China and other members of the Security Council.
They wanted it lifted. But I guess I'm saying that the oil for food program, worked in a way. That Saddam Hussein was denied acquisition of weapons of mass destruction, and the Iraqi population on a whole fared better than they would have had that program, had the humanitarian assistance not been delivered to them. Although I do agree that there was obviously skimming from the top. Maybe I wanted to go back to sort of. You've laid out sort of a very substantive critique of the UN, and I'm wondering sort of what do you have sort of a remedy? Do you want the U.S. to pull out of the UN? Do you want
no? I don't think that the U.S. needs. I don't think the U.S. needs to pull out of the UN.
Okay.
But I don't think that we need to adopt this as the gold standard of multilateral diplomacy, which is what many of the UN advocates here in the U.S. seem to want. This was an argument that was made a lot during the run-up to the Iraq invasion, was that we had to have Security Council approval before we could do anything abroad. And that's just ridiculous. I mean, I think that the UN Security Council and the UN itself makes for a useful tool in multilateral diplomacy, but it should not be at all the only tool that we use. And it should not be. It should not be we shouldn't need to feel that we have to have their approval before we act in our own interest, whatever we see that interest being. And I think it would be better to have a parallel organization which consists of countries where their people are free, where we're dealing with the legitimate, popular representatives of those people, so that we can have a structure in which there's more accountability for the actions of the organization. And we simply don't have that with the UN, because most of the large percentage of the nations that are at the UN don't have that kind of representative government, so there is no accountability for the actions.
I guess so. You're alluding to the idea of sort of having a parallel concert of democracies type structure.
Sure. That
might sort of, as you say, grant legitimacy, because you seem to concede the point by saying that you want a concert of democracies. You seem to be conceding the point that having foreign approval of American actions abroad lends credibility and legitimacy and credence to that.
Well, yeah, no, I would say that's absolutely true. It's always better for a nation to have friends when they go act in some international way. It's always better to have your friends with you. And I think that if all of your friends tell you that they're not going to go with you, it's a good reason to sit and say, maybe we need to rethink this direction. But the UN doesn't qualify for that.
I have to. You've laid this up for me. I have to hit it. For example, France in the run-up to the Iraq War, our ally France, warned us that this might not be the wisest or most prudent adventure of use of American military power at the time. Wouldn't a concert of democracies we have listened to France's advice?
Well, I don't know. We had plenty of democracies on our side when we went into Iraq. We had the UK. We had Spain. We had Italy. It wasn't just. I mean, France was saying no. I would also like to point out, though, with that example, since you've set this one up for me, that France was one of the countries that was getting kickbacks from Saddam Hussein and kicking back to Saddam Hussein as part of the oil for food scandal. So they had a few more. Okay. This is part of the problem. They had a lot of interest that they didn't want exposed. That UN, by the way, that scandal only got exposed after the invasion, when we found the documents on the other end. When we captured the documents that were being hidden by Saddam Hussein. That's the only reason we found out about that oil for food scandal.
I should also say that it wasn't just sort of French nationals. American nationals were also receiving kickbacks as well. There's currently an elderly oil man in Texas on trial right now.
There was one.
Yeah.
There was one.
I
he wasn't a member of the government. There were members of the government in France and Russia.
He was an oil man.
Right.
I guess. Sorry, I've lost track of what. I love what you just said. But getting back to this idea of concert of democracies. I guess one problem is once you have this parallel structure, then it seems to me that presumably to avoid a potential veto from, say, China or Russia, who are the only two Security Council members not full democracies. It seems to me that sort of any action you take would be perceived as a threat to, say, Beijing or Moscow. And, for example, if we're going to try to resolve the North Korea crisis, I think we want to bring, China on our side. We don't want to be sort of creating a parallel sort of adversary to them. It seems to me that if we look at this through Beijing's eyes, they might feel threatened by anything other than that. And it seems to me we want to have them on their side as much as possible.
Well, Mark, first off, I'll address this by saying we did set up a parallel organization that included China to resolve the North Korea crisis, and it worked pretty well. The second thing is that we worked through the UN on Kosovo, and do you think that the Russians feel that the Kosovo resolution was not a threat to them? Was not a slam against them? Because right now they're talking about recognizing the separatists in Abkhazia as a result of the Kosovo resolution that the UN pretty much defaulted to.
And but when you say the UN, I mean, when you say the UN created this, it was the United States government pursuing this. It was to a similar degree the French and the British pursuing this as well.
Well,
versus the Russians. I mean, we're not talking about the UN as an institution. We're talking about
no. The UN had this ball for 9 years. They did nothing with it. They only just started talking about it, and they dropped it because Russia wouldn't participate.
But it dropped. It was the Security Council that was unable to resolve this in a way
that is why
to the Russians.
That is my point. The UN could not. After they didn't do anything about it for 9 years, and when they finally 8 years, and when they finally picked it up, there was an impasse. They just the structure of the UN did not allow them to pursue this because Russia just simply balked, and so what were we going to do with Kosovo? Were we going to sit there for 40 years waiting for the Russians to change leadership and hoping that maybe they wouldn't mind so much if Kosovo became independent? No. And so, the UN had years of opportunity to deal with this situation, and they could have dealt with it when Russia was quite a bit weaker. Maybe 5 or 6 years ago, when Russian nationalism and Russian sort of neo-imperialism hadn't quite reared its ugly head yet. They had opportunities to deal with this. They just simply didn't do it, and it sat and it festered. And finally, you have to have some sort of resolution to this. You either that, or you have to occupy that space for the next 40 years. And quite simply, nobody really wanted to do that.
I guess again, when you say sort of the UN sort of dropped the ball, I don't see Kosovo, the debate over Kosovo and Russia's inability to agree to the Ahtisaari plan is what it was, as something that tarnishes sort of the UN as an institution. I see it as a failure of diplomacy on the part, principally of the United States and Russia.
What I'm saying though, Mark, is that what I'm saying though is that even working through the UN, you're going to have situations where Russia or China or the United States feels threatened because of the track of diplomacy. So it really doesn't make a lot of difference. I mean, it's really the issue, the specific issues in which you find yourself that apply to that sort of issue or threat or whatever you want to call it. But the fact is that the UN was the administrator of Kosovo. They took over the administration of Kosovo. They were the ones running it. They were the ones who were supposed to resolve it. And Europe got tired of waiting. And so did the Kosovars. And on both sides, they got tired of waiting. And after 9 years, it needed to be resolved. It needed to be resolved years ago. And the UN simply didn't do anything to resolve it.
I guess so. So KFOR provided security. The NATO provided security
under the UN administration.
They have a parallel structure.
The KFOR had a mandate from the UN to provide security. The UN had the mandate to resolve Kosovo. It was under the UN's mandate.
Well, the UN's mandate, the specific UN sort of organization of the UN, the bureaucracy of the UN's mandate was to create UNMIK, the United Nations mission in Kosovo, which, among other things, trained a Kosovar police force, set up provisional institutions of government, helped them set up their parliament,
but
trained the judiciary.
But the resolution of Kosovo's status
was building work.
The resolution of Kosovo's status was supposed to have been was part of that mandate. They were the ones that were mandated to resolve Kosovo's status because they were the UN.
I guess it's sort of Kosovo's status is an international legal question that can only be determined by the Security Council, so which are a group of the 5 member states of the UN. And the UN's work in Kosovo was something entirely different. It was not. It was not. It was not. It could not decide on UNMIK. Could not decide whether or not Kosovo should be or should not be an independent country. Only the Security Council.
But again, the Security Council didn't, and that's the UN. I will grant you that the UN's subsidiary agencies, some of their subsidiary agencies, do good work. UNICEF is one of them, and I will grant you that some of their subsidiary agencies do really good work. That's not work that is necessarily unique to the UN. There are other organizations that do the same kind of work and do very good work as well. My issue is the idea that that multilateral diplomacy has to be conducted at the level that it is at the UN, and that it requires the UN before you can take actions, and that you can't form parallel organizations of democracies, for instance, as we talked about earlier, without somehow threatening the world order. This is a tool, and it is one of many tools. And I think that the emphasis on the UN as the be-all and end-all of multilateral diplomacy is very misguided. And given the fact that the UN has a consistent record of not being able to make tough decisions and reach settlements like we're seeing in Kosovo, and the oil for food scandal and everything else, I think that it is severely overrated as a multilateral organization. That's the conservative point of view on the UN, as far as I see it.
Mm-hmm. I guess I'm sympathetic to the idea that the UN is a tool of American foreign policy. It's sort of a controversial thing to say. People inside the UN don't say it, but to me, I see the UN as sort of when the U.S. works with the UN, there's little that it can accomplish, that it cannot accomplish, I should say, it's sort of the degree to which the United States works with the UN and frankly agrees to constrain itself to the UN it helps to ensure, in many ways, sort of Americans' dominance over sort of the world order. So again, we in the beginning you talked about sort of the UN as this institution set up sort of during the Cold War. It was actually set up before in the very early stages of the Cold War, largely by Americans, and set up in a way to ensure American dominance and supremacy over sort of the New World Order. And the degree to which we work with the UN is the degree to which we can ensure American dominance and supremacy in the future as well.
No, I disagree with you on that. I think that there may be some truth in what you say at its inception, but for decades the UN has been used to harness Americans, American foreign policy, American activity abroad in a way that keeps us from acting on our own interest. And I think that it's a mistake for the United States to participate in that to that extent at the UN. And I think that this overwhelming emphasis on Security Council approvals that we've seen over the last decade or so since the end of the Cold War is a throwback to an era that just doesn't exist any longer. And I think we're far better off when we use the UN as all nations do. It's not just the Americans who use the UN as a tool in multilateral diplomacy. I think every nation uses the UN as a tool in multilateral diplomacy. But it isn't the only tool in the toolbox, and I think that it is certainly not the paragon of multilateral diplomacy that a lot of people like to paint it.
You sort of talked about the ways in which sort of the UN constrains American sort of.
That's a better word. Thank you. That was the word I was reaching for.
That's right. But I sort of there are also a lot of ways in which the UN adds value to American sort of foreign policy priorities as well. I mean, if you look at, for example, right now there are some like 90,000 peacekeepers around the world in 20 missions. There are sort of almost 200 Americans among them. So the American footprint is very light. Yet peacekeepers in places like Liberia or Lebanon or the Cote d'Ivoire or Sierra Leone, they're there preventing the place from either falling apart, or if they've done their job preventing the place from falling apart, they're now building it up and building those state institutions and doing the kind of nation building that the UN is uniquely situated and qualified to do.
Well, but the problem with the peacekeepers is that they don't keep the peace. The problem with the peacekeepers is that they pretty much act as observers and nothing more. I think that the last war the last Lebanon war was a great example of that. UNIFIL had been there for 20 years. And yet Hezbollah, Hezbollah had formed their own army, which dwarfed that of the Lebanese army, and launched and continuously launched attacks across the border at Israel until Israel finally responded. And they didn't prevent Hezbollah from rearming after that war. They have the same capabilities now that they did prior to the launch of that war in 2006. It was a mirage.
Prior, UNIFIL won prior to the Israel, the IDF Hezbollah war in the summer of 2006. There were very few and a very small UN force with a very weak mandate. Subsequent to that, we now have a larger UN force with a more robust mandate.
But the more robust mandate has not
in northern Israel and southern Lebanon.
But the more robust mandate hasn't kept Hezbollah from rearming and getting themselves right back in the same position they were before in the Sub-Litani region. They can launch the same exact war that they did before, and they can do it. They can do it, and the UN will not stop them. Will not lift a finger from them doing it. The UN mandate was supposed to keep them from allowing Syria to rearm Hezbollah, and they didn't do it. They refused to do it. The peacekeepers that were there said they refused to do it.
Well, part of that mandate was to have the Lebanese armed forces actually reassert control over southern Lebanon and have the UN sort of mostly actually French and Spanish and German troops, French and Spanish and Italian troops help them do that.
No, I think Germans are there too.
Disarmament was not in the mandate. The UN, you can't have like a random, a peacekeeper can't just take law into his own hands and disarm someone if it's not in their mandate. But again, you say that to use another example, because that's sort of not like a Chapter 7 mission. Right now, that's a Chapter 6 mission. Right now, there are other Chapter 7 missions, like say in Haiti, where you actually do have UN troops sort of taking on a more assertive role. For example, last February, the UN mission there launched an incursion into a slum occupied by a sort of criminal kingpin that was threatening to destabilize the government there. So you had UN troops, mostly Brazilian and Jordanian, actually, like asserting control over a sector of Port-au-Prince called Cité Soleil, vast slum, which was sort of the source of a lot of opposition to the current government, violent opposition to the current government, and were able to root out sort of the sort of hostile elements in Haiti. And it seems to me that to me at least, the point I was trying to make, that adds great value to American interests. You're having Jordanian and Brazilian troops do it, not say the U.S. Marines.
No, I agree, but you're first off, I'm going to make 2 points on this. One, you don't have to have the UN to bring in multilateral forces in order to make that a reality. The second thing is that if we want to talk peacekeepers with the UN, then we also have to talk about some of the scandals associated with those peacekeepers. We've had peacekeeping troops in a number of applications who have sexually exploited women and children in these refugee areas, involving UN personnel, not just the troops, but also involving UN personnel. And that doesn't come from the conservatives. That comes from the Independent, which is a very left-wing newspaper in Britain.
It's not like it's not the imagination of conservatives.
Over a dozen applications, there has been no oversight. There is no accountability, and it goes back to the structural issues that you have with the UN. There's no oversight. There's no accountability, and because you're dealing with nations that are not democracies, that in many cases are almost as oppressive as the nations in which they're being applied. you wind up with situations like this.
I guess one of the what you say is a serious problem, or it's a real problem, I should say, and it has happened. And one of the structural problems that you identify is that peacekeepers in many cases come from the developing world. It's a way for developing world countries to almost subsidize their armies. It costs $1,100 per peacekeeper per day. To send a peacekeeper on this. Now, the good thing is, we don't have an excess capacity of troops in NATO. They're fighting their war in Afghanistan. We're in Iraq. We can't do things like help settle the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's just not in the American troops. There are no excess capacity, but we will, have Indian troops or Bangladeshi troops do it for us, so long as we help contribute, so long as we help pay them. The problem is, though, so once you have a peacekeeper accused of committing a crime, a sexual crime, in, say, like the DRC, this peacekeeper mission, so the UN doesn't have sort of the ability to criminally prosecute peacekeepers. And I don't think any government in the world would want to give the UN the power to criminally prosecute their own members of their own armed forces. What the UN can do is repatriate them, is kick them out of the mission and send them home. Now, at that point, it's up to the local authority to prosecute the individual peacekeeper. The problem is, the local authority may not want to. The Bangladeshi prosecutor may not want to, or he may want to, but it's really hard for the UN to force these kind of prosecutions. And that's the crux of the problem. There are a few ways to remedy this. One is to have a sort of a convention, have it so that only people who sign this convention agree to prosecute their peacekeepers in their national court or in a local courts martial, depending on the system. But only members who sign that convention can contribute peacekeepers to a mission. So that's one option. It is a tremendously thorny issue.
Okay, Mark, but I've been writing about this since 2004, and so has the Independent. It's been almost 4 years, May of 2004. What's the UN done about this situation? What action have they taken? They haven't formed this convention that you're talking about.
They've explored it, and it's now, frankly, it's the member states to agree on it. They've instituted a zero tolerance policy, spearheaded by an American at the UN, Jane Hall-Lute, who was a former general, actually.
Yes.
And she's and she's sort of she works in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. She's on top of it, and I urge sort of viewers to sort of Google her name and zero tolerance, and you'll get a sense of what the policy is. But essentially, it's sort of greater oversight. They recognize that there were lapses in the past, and they're doing better now to repatriate those peacekeepers.
But after 4 years, the UN has not done anything to hold the people accountable who were part of this. And they haven't really, they've made some changes along the margins, but they haven't really addressed the big issues of accountability, at the moment when these things are occurring, other than to refer back to the member nations that the troops come from. And they don't have the ability. That's part of the problem. Otherwise you have to, it starts getting into areas of sovereignty and that sort of thing. It's an issue. It's a tough issue. I am not saying that there is a simple solution for this, but what I'm saying is that there has been a marked lack of inertia in dealing with this situation at the UN because there's no accountability there.
See, I guess when talking about peacekeeping, this is an issue, and it's something that it can't be sort of swept under the rug. At the same time, I don't want to lose sight of the other work that UN peacekeepers do, putting their lives on the line in far off places, where frankly they probably have little interest, like Southern Sudan or DRC, or say a country like Liberia, where the UN peacekeeping was able to transform itself from like a stabilization operation to a larger nation building effort. We have our first female head of state, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, there. Very pro-American, one should say. To the extent, if the United States is going to put an African command in Africa, it's probably going to be in Liberia, and that's because of the structures, the roots of their democracy have been planted thanks to the sort of comprehensive peace building work and nation building work that the UN has done there. So it's we need to sort of, I think, take a bigger perspective here. We're just about out of time. Do you have any for final thoughts? Anything else you want to add, Ed?
No, I do want to thank you though, Mark, because this has been. I think it's been a great conversation. I think it's a conversation it's fun. People should have these kind of conversations. We should step out of our echo chambers from time to time and engage each other.
I like it. I went on your radio show a few weeks ago to talk about a blog project I'm working on called onday1.org, and you were gracious and generous with your plugs, so I want to return the favor as well. And I hopefully we can make this sort of a reoccurring thing if you're into it.
Love it. This has been great.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ed. Ed Morrissey, Captain's Quarters now. What's the new site?
Hotair.com.
Hotair.com. Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Ed, and look forward to talking.
Same here, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, Ed.